So good evening, everybody. Well, I'm hoping that David's introduction to say how do we get IKEA didn't completely put you off the subject, because really that's just what we call a tag. It's to make you think about Scandinavian design more broadly, but to make it more relevant to our lifestyle today. So as you can see, we're going to cover quite a big era. From 1880 to 1960. I'm going to take you right the way from the arts and crafts movement and Art Nouveau, exemplified by my Royal Copenhagen, either coffee or chocolate pot at the top, with rather beautiful dragonflies and a bee on the top of it, on the top of the lid. Then we're going to go from Art Nouveau and arts and crafts right the way through Art Deco to Modernism, which is my Alvar Aalto chair in Bentwood. And only then will we get to IKEA to sort of explain why Scandinavia became such an important force in the world of design at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and why does IKEA appeal to us? Well, really, it's appealed to us for the last 30 years, particularly women like me, who basically want a streamlined, modernistic interior that doesn't take a lot of looking after. I'm too busy doing other things to worry about the dusting. So we've got an image down the bottom from a relatively recent IKEA catalogue. But don't fret, there's only a very small portion of the entire lecture is on IKEA. I want to start off by just reminding you about the diaspora, the way in which designers move around the world. So the Scandinavian contingent have been responsible for some of the most important buildings in the world. So this is Utzon's wonderful opera house in Sydney, which, as you can see, took a long time to build because it was so avant-garde, not just in its design, but in its use of materials. They ran out of money to complete it properly, and the interior, as Utzon intended, was only, in fact, added relatively recently in the last 10 or so years. A lot of people talk about what it's supposed to represent. So some people say it represents waves, because obviously you're in Sydney Harbour. Other people say that it's like leaping fish or dolphins. And other people say it looks rather like a Terry's chocolate orange after you've broken it apart. I'll let you decide what you think it represents, but I think you'll agree with me that it's a building that you all instantaneously recognised. So that's our first Dane. Now we have a Finn. The diaspora was particularly acute in Scandinavia around the time of the First World War. So many people left Scandinavia at that point to find a better life in the New World. Many, of course, went to America. And this is Eero Saarinen. His father, Eliel, was the chap who emigrated, and they'll settle at the famous Cranbrook colony. But this is one of Eero Saarinen's most famous, can I call it a building? I think it's more a monument. This is the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial for when America looked west, hence its name, Gateway Arch or Gateway to the West. Nowadays, there's a lift which will take you right to the top and give you a panoramic view. But I want you to notice again how long it took to build it. 1947, not finished, as you can see, until 1965, conceived in 47. But it often takes a while for us to catch up with our progressive architects. Mr. Geary, Frank Geary, notwithstanding. So Scandinavia, I'll tell you exactly what I mean by Scandinavia in just a minute, but it's been acclaimed for being bold on the one hand in terms of its design, but very conservative in terms of its traditions. Its handicraft traditions were not wiped out by industrialization, because really until the end of the 19th century, the Scandinavian countries were quite poor. So to show you what I mean about a bold design, but conservative traditions, I've got a piece of Orrefors glass at the top. Orrefors is clear glass and then hand carved on a lapidary wheel, a very old tradition. The brooch down the bottom is by Georg Jensen, who is the most important silversmith of our area, but also the most important silversmith of the 19th, early 20th century. So the Orrefors is Swedish, Georg Jensen is Danish, as is Arne Jacobsen, whose famous chair you might well have sat on, as it's used in many Costa coffees, when we were allowed to go to them, that is, and is often described as the world's best-selling chair. I'll explain why later. So I'm going to concentrate on the 4 most obvious Scandinavian countries. I'm not going to include Iceland. I'll give you a map in a minute, but this is just to remind you of the political complexities of the area. So Sweden and Finland were joined at the hip for something like 600 years, until 1809, when Russia conquered Finland in the 1808 to 1809 war. And so what you have in the area is you have dominant powers, Sweden and Denmark, and then underdogs, Finland. So it may surprise you to know that Finland doesn't actually gain its independence from either Sweden or Russia until 1917, with, of course, the Russian Revolution. The same story is reprised in Norway, united with Denmark until 1814, and the whole area obviously is shaken up by the Napoleonic War. And what happens after 1814 is that Norway is connected to Sweden, and they rule over Norway until 1905. That's when Norway gets its independence. So it may surprise you to know that you have got 2 countries, Finland and Norway, that don't gain independence from a nearby power until the opening years of the 20th century. So patriotism and nationalism are going to be important components in the way that they think about their identity. And I'm showing you Geiranger Fjord in June. I was very lucky. I used to work on Minerva and did many a cruise to Norway in particular. And you can see here, June, it's still got quite a lot of snow on the mountains, and you're looking towards the Five Sisters famous waterfall. So talking of climate and geography, so obviously Norway is renowned for its mountains and fjords. So if you've ever been to the Flam Railway, you will know that they ask you, well, they stop the train and they ask you to get out. And you stand looking at this magnificent waterfall, and then miraculously the rocks around you start to sing this rather melodic tune. And then appearing out of the waterfall, we have this character known as the Huldra. The Huldra may look alluring, but she is actually a troll, and her tail is disguised by her costume. She will, of course, gentlemen, lure you to your death on the rocks below, as like many trolls, she's rather a, a naughty character, but worse than that, a destructive character, a femme fatale. I was playing around with my gender here because the Huldra is traditionally a woman, but the role of playing the Huldra is rather demanding, as you have to stand in a waterfall all day long. And so it's traditionally, or not so traditionally, but more recently, played by a man, as you can see here. I love it. So because we're dealing with this idea of national identity, folklore and folk tales in particular are going to be very important to all my Scandinavian countries, whether we're looking at Norway or here Sweden or Denmark or Finland. So this is Carl Larsson. We'll see more of him later. And this is the Midwinter Festival at Gamla Uppsala. It's taking us back to the Vikings, or even before, in the so-called migration period, those famous ship burials like Sutton Hoo. This is now installed in the National Gallery, but it caused a lot of consternation when it was originally planned around about 1910. Because the main figure, as you can see, of the king is stark naked, which did indeed upset a few Swedes. The important thing is this idea of celebrating their Viking heritage, and all our Scandinavian countries can celebrate their Viking heritage. The other important thing to bring to mind is the climate. So they have very long and very harsh winters. This is Axel Gallen-Kallela. He is Finland's most important artist, and his rendering here of winter, a close-up of the snow on the boughs of a fir tree, give you a really good idea just of the weight of the snow and the darkness at the midwinter solstice, which of course is what's being celebrated here at Gamla Uppsala. It's the midwinter festival. In the summer, however, it's the other extreme. We have the land of the midnight sun. But like any other natural phenomena, it's sometimes quite hard to see the midnight sun. It's often midnight gloom because you've got to have a clear night to actually get, you know, a clear view of the sun. It took me about 4 cruises. So here is the midnight sun at about 2 o'clock in the morning. I've stayed up to watch it. It doesn't really ever set. It just hits the horizon and then goes back up again. And this is when I was working on Minerva. My image of it here is by Peder Severin Krøyer, one of Denmark's most famous artists. And he painted at a place called Skagen, which was rather like the Newlyn School, in the sense that many artists gravitated to Skagen. You don't pronounce the G in Danish, by the way. Gravitated to Skagen to paint during the summer. This is Krøyer's wife, Maria, and Anna Anker walking along the beach somewhere around about midnight, or what is often referred to as the blue hour. It was a particular sort of colour in the, well, the whole sort of mood of the blue hour. Many artists tried to capture it. So because summers are short and winters are long, I think it's true to say that all my Scandinavian countries make the most of summer. They want to lead an outdoor life. They are lucky in that they are able to build summer houses, so they'll often have a city dwelling and a summer house. And the house that you're looking at here is looking out over the Oslo fjord. This is typical of the way in which they like open spaces. And these are nowadays heated. Don't forget that Norway is now very wealthy since they discovered gas and well, particularly gas and oil at the end of the 1960s. The capital is Stavanger for the oil and gas industry. But the important thing is they also have plenty of hot water, literally, to enable them to have these open plan houses, which is their preference. And they very much focus on the dining area because it's very expensive to eat out in Norway. So you can see here both indoors and outside that it's very much linked to this idea of home life and conviviality. They don't like a lot of clutter. They don't like carpets or curtains. These vast expanses of glass, don't worry, nobody can overlook you. You're on Oslo Fjord and your nearest neighbour is several miles away. So the idea of minimalism is very important in understanding the Scandinavian mindset. They like in Australia, big spaces. So you'll have a breakfast area that flows into a dining area. And here you don't need any art because the view through the window at the end provides all the art that you need. And the beautiful chairs around the table here are by Hans Wiener. You'll see it spelt later because remember, when you're looking at any of these languages, it's a bit of a challenge. But Hans Wiener is Danish, and I'm showing you 2 of his famous chairs from 1952 and 1949. These are described as Modernist with a capital M, and they are now very much classics that you might find also in the so-called retro interior. So I'm just going to give you a little introduction to each of our major Scandinavian countries. Remember that I've cheated, I've left out Iceland. And I thought I had a map, but that's done a runner on me, so I do apologise. But remember that we are situated around the Baltic. We have Norway, Sweden and Finland, and then Denmark is really part of Europe. It's attached to the European mainland. So very different in terms of its connections. Denmark looked very much towards England and the arts and crafts movement, or south to Germany. And it's going to become famous really for luxury products. So Royal Copenhagen represented here, an Art Nouveau piece with a dragonfly on it. Georg Jensen again for the metalwork. And here is Hans Wegner. So V-W and no G, so it's pronounced Wiener. And he died relatively recently, as you can see. You know, so he was keeping the arts and crafts tradition going in terms of this idea of beautiful craftsmanship, but also natural materials. We're going to discover that natural materials are very important in all my Scandinavian countries. Norway brings to the table very much its Vikings, but do remember, if you've been watching The Last Kingdom, which I'm addicted to, you know, we have the Norse, i.e. the Norwegian Vikings, and we have the Danes, obviously the Danegeld, the Danish Vikings. We don't get the Swedish ones. They went in the other direction towards Russia. But all through the Scandinavian countries, the Viking legacy is very important. When we get national romanticism, this is this idea again of identifying your culture through your ethnicity, then the Vikings are going to become very important, and it's known as the Old Norse or dragon style in Norway. This is the amazing reconstruction of a stave or starved church at Fantoft. The original was sadly destroyed, but they've rebuilt it beautifully. And flying off the top, these are dragons, hence dragon style. And you'll find dragons and backbiting animals in many of the jewelry styles associated with the Vikings as well. So I'm showing you here, in fact, it's a 19th century reimagining of the Viking style of backbiting animals. And the culture of the Vikings was also very keyed into horses. So my cup at the top here is horses rather than dragons, and the technique is enamel work, which was a particular art form that they loved in Norway. However, I think one of the most important things that Norway brings to the table is angst. So I couldn't resist showing you here Edvard Munch's most famous painting of the Screen, which still lives in Oslo and was painted at the beginning of the 1890s. You can ask me more about that at the end. So Finland gains its independence from Russia in 1917. And like Sweden, it very much believed that it could recover its economy by maximizing its potential in terms of art and design. So it wanted to revolutionize its productions, bring them up to date, make them modern, but it also wanted to make them affordable. So we have Marimekko, which was founded in 1951, which is best known really for its textiles. And Marimekko became particularly popular because of Jackie Kennedy. She used to wear Marimekko dresses. You might recognize the poppy from the 1960s. Tapio Vakala down the bottom, his chanterelle glass. Well, they're one-offs, they're blown, but they could be mass-produced using molds. And they were in production until, again, quite recently, the 1960s, 1970s. And then using a plywood rather than metal, we have the Artec company of Alvar Aalto and the tank chair of 1936. So Finland, so we've got Denmark very much concentrating on the upper end of the market, luxury products, porcelain, silver and handcrafted furniture, whereas in Finland and in Sweden, they wanted to go to sort of like the other end of the spectrum. They wanted to make good design available to all. And we'll see in a minute how IKEA achieves that. However, don't think that Swedish design is just all about IKEA. This is the equivalent of Liberties in Stockholm. Svensk 10, it literally means Swedish pewter, which was the original name of the shop, but now it sells everything, as you can see, but really predominantly fabrics. And their chief designer is actually a Viennese who fled to Sweden during the Nazi period. And these fantastically bold fabrics, which he designed in the 1930s, are still in production today. So you can see a room setting at the top there in the wonderful gallery, very like Liberties in the heart of Stockholm. I always have to have a visit, but I can't afford very much. So one of the interesting discussions that comes out of looking at Scandinavia is how to make good design affordable. And obviously IKEA really set out to achieve that. The first IKEA store that you see here opened in 1958 is, believe it or not, now a museum devoted to showing you how the IKEA style has changed over the years. They arrived in the UK in 1987, but initially we were very limited in terms of IKEA stores. We actually have one now here in Southampton, so if I want to get my fix, I haven't got very far to go. But more recently, they've been opening up in China, South America, and India. So the first thing is, why is it called IKEA? Well, the first part, the I and the K, is the name of the founder. Fedor, real name, first name, Ingvar Kamprad, which you can see, and he died again quite recently. And I always joke that he was rather frugal, and he moved to Switzerland in order to have some creative accountancy. Ironically, therefore, in 2015, he was down as the 8th wealthiest person in the world. As you can see, 58.7 billion, because IKEA has never been floated on the stock exchange. So in effect, it's still a private company. In fact, to be precise, a lot of it is now a charity. That was one of the ways that they could get around the tax evasion issue. So the I and the K is Ingvar Kamprad. And then he was, now I apologize for my Swedish here, Elmtarad and Angudarad, I'm there, so if you've got any Swedes you can correct me, were the farm and the village where he grew up. So that's why it's called IKEA. And technically the company is founded when he's only 17 in 1943. And initially he sold matchsticks. And many people would argue that things haven't changed that much in terms of his furniture. So this is a rather, again, stereotypical image that we have of the designer. Clearly he's supposed to be French, he's got a beret and a pair of glasses, and he's feeling nauseous because, of course, IKEA has undercut him, elite designers against IKEA. We can also talk in this realm about habitat. But we was also trying to make good design, that's Mr. Conrad, make good design available to all. So it's quite a thorny issue, isn't it? The idea of actually making good design affordable. Don't worry, this is my only text, but I thought you'd like a few staggering statistics. This is very up to date, as you can see. 2021, there are 445 IKEA stores operating in 52 countries. They're planning to open a lot more. They hope to open somewhere around 50 new stores in the next couple of years, including one in Hampstead. I don't think Truro is on the list. That may be a relief. In 2020, they were down a bit, only 39.6 billion, because of course a lot of the shops were shut. They make up for that with their 12,000 products, which you can buy on their internet or website. The latest numbers I could get for their websites take us back to 2016, when 2.1 billion visitors went to look at those 12,000 objects. I'm sure that, in fact, last year the numbers were far greater than that. And they have more recently been opening up in India. Riga was 2018, and as I said, they're hoping to add 50, even though they are moving towards more online shopping. I think they realize that the way that IKEA hooks you is going to see all of the showrooms, you know, the way they lay out everything. So you can imagine what it might look like in your own home. And what they sell you is a bit of a myth: good design, good function, and good quality with low prices. And most importantly, the only way that you can achieve that is through self-sufficiency or DIY. So here's a rather lovely cartoon. Make a chair and take a seat, applying for a job at IKEA. Yes?
Yeah.
Oh, where the idea of DIY comes in is with the Lovette table, which the designer Lundgren was trying to get into his car, and realizing that it wouldn't fit in, he took the legs off. So that's supposed to be the origins of the DIY job, 1956. If you've been to visit IKEA and seen its room settings in the 1950s, that is what it would have looked like. A lot of teak there. Don't get rid of your teak now. It's coming back into fashion. By the 1960s, it looked like this. Lots of orange, lots of yellow, very psychedelic. And Mary Quant sitting in a foam chair. I do love those white plastic boots. And again, these are all from, don't laugh, the museum, the IKEA store that's been turned into a museum in Sweden. And then the poem armchair of 1976, you might recognize, It's definitely one of IKEA's best sellers. Here, the minimalism of Japan and the natural materials of Sweden come together with Nobuo Nakamura's wonderful cantilevered chair. And now I think the emphasis is on grey, as you can see. I'm hoping we go out of this phase quite soon, as I love colour. The one thing that you're all likely to have in your home is a Billy bookcase. They start from as little as £10, again designed by Gillis Lundgren. Allegedly, you're supposed to buy your Billy and make it your own by what you put on it. Allegedly, there are over 60 million of the world, and they estimate that one is made or bought every 7 seconds. They're now at the moment made in Sweden in a totally automated factory, just robots, not people. I wanted to show you again this rather antiquated, looks very antiquated now, doesn't it? IKEA storage system, natural wood, from 1968. And they also estimate that IKEA uses more wood, 1% of all the wood in the world. So I couldn't resist showing you this new IKEA store, which is in Vienna, where the inside and the outside have become as one, and there are lots of trees that have been planted. So their sort of claims to being green are frequently challenged in the media. So this is how you're supposed to visit IKEA. You're supposed to go around in this very ordered fashion, as you can see, going around all those room settings and then down into the market store and hopefully coming out with lots of lovely things, including your Swedish meatballs. Evidently, that's how we actually do it. And there's many a husband who probably will appreciate this cartoon coming up here. Do you think we might die before we get out of IKEA? Right, that's the end of IKEA in terms of our story this evening. So I want to take you from arts and crafts to Scandi Modern, which is the immediate post-Second World War era, finishing about 1968. So here we are to kick off to show you how materials and technology changes throughout the 20th century. The Gabrielle Kieland Arts and Crafts Chair, and the Vernon Panton. Originally, this was made out of fiberglass. Now it's made in plastic, and it was acquired notoriety more recently because Gordon Ramsay was seen sitting on one. However, I'm going to start our story properly with Carl Larsson, who is seen by many to be the spirit of IKEA. And there are very few Swedish homes that do not have the lazing corner on its walls. It typifies really Swedish grace, or the Swedish style, dominated, as you can see, by blue and white. So Carl Larsson is not only Sweden's most famous designer, arts and craftsman, he's also Sweden's most famous painter. But his paintings become particularly well known through his illustrated books. So I was celebrating his centenary, as you can see, in 1919. His wife is very much, it's a partnership. This is like looking at Charles William Mackintosh and his wife, Margaret MacDonald, with Karen, who was very talented in her own right, largely providing the soft furnishings and the embroidery. Her first child, one of 8, was born in 1884, and this is all really about homemaking. So what you're going to see as you see these images, you'll often see Karen in the background, because really Carl Larsson concentrates on his home life and his family through a series of books. So here's the front cover of one, and you might well have these on your own bookcase. The first one was Etterhem, a home, then a farm, and then on the sunny side of 1910. And these are the front covers, just to emphasize that it was very much in the English arts and crafts tradition of leaving the city and going in search of the good life. And it did help having 8 children, remember. I love this one where they're all out of doors with the dog having, you know, lunch under the tree, and the beer down here being kept cool in the shade of the tree. At this stage, they're still living in Stockholm, and their backgrounds are very different. I mean, we know from Carl Larsson's autobiography that he came from the wrong side of the tracks. He was from Gamla Stan when it was a hovel. That's the posh part of Stockholm today. And Karen was from a very nice upper middle class family, but art brought them together. Both looked very much towards England. We know that they had all of these on their bookshelf. German art and decoration, the famous English The Studio, all these wonderful avant-garde magazines, and the French equivalent Art et Decoration. and these are two of the children. They have, they're given a little fact, you know, I said at the beginning that they often have two homes, one in the city, one in the countryside, and the Larssons were no, you know, exception. So they were given through, in fact, Karen's father, this little hut on the water at Lilla, Hyttnas, which is in Sudborn in the province of Dalarna, which is like north of Stockholm, out in the wilderness, about 2.5 hours. At least 200 kilometers above Stockholm, in an area which was a bit like going to Cornwall, really, an area which was very unspoiled and where a lot of rural traditions had survived. And my images show you here how it grew, because by 1900 they decided to give up living in the city and to live permanently at Lilla. So it starts off as a little tiny, as you can see, hut, and then develops into a house and studio, and then that's this image here, and then this big studio was added after 1900, so it grows like Topsy. And Larsson was from the outset really interested in folk art. So this is Anders Zorn celebrating the Midsummer Dance. Please notice the red house in the background. You notice how Larsson's house is red. This was seen to be very much a native colour, particularly in Norway. But remember, they could borrow Norway until 1905 in terms of cultural traditions. And one of the most important traditions in Norway is textiles, embroidery. So I'm showing you a lovely little line of ladies in their national, or I should even say regional costume, because every fjord, every town has its own take on its local costume. So the lady that we're looking at here is in Bergen. That's her local costume. She's about to play some Grieg, by the way. We're in Trondheim, which is the beautiful home of the composer Edvard Grieg, all Norwegian. And Larsson was keen to preserve as much as he could of these traditions, which were fast disappearing. So he painted this wonderful image, as you can see here, of an interior with all of the ladies, including the one with a pipe, working on some sort of, you know, project, knitting, spinning. Look at all the lovely painted decoration on the wall. And he really likes this idea that Swedish identity can be rooted in folk culture. If you get a chance to visit Stockholm, don't miss the wonderful Nordic Museum, where I photographed that wonderful cabinet. So you can see all of these ideas spilling into his own home. And this is really the IKEA link, that you're not making a house, you're creating a home. Karen is often looking down at you when you go around the interiors. This is between Christmas and the New Year, when you are likely to be stuck indoors. And what I want you to spot is the cabinet down here, which is still at Lilla. Here it is. It's been signed as though it's a painting. Signed and dated 1896, Carl Larsson. So just like William Morris, Larsson didn't make any distinction between the fine and the decorative arts. He melded it all into one, as a Gesamtkunstwerk, or total artwork. He also loved making things like William Morris. So we see him here in his workshop with his saw. He would make his own furniture. And we see him in the top image with, in fact, two of the local labourers. They're painting, and you can see that Carl is watching them. He's in the mirror. But the important thing is that Larsson, like Morris, gets a lot of pleasure out of making things. So he's got a wonderful memorial here to the carpenter Hans. Not only to the idea again of craft, but can you see all these little, all these wonderful references here to tools on the wall in the background? And you'll often see Carl with his little puppet, this little figure here, which was something of his alter ego. He suffered rather from depression, but then it would appear to be, indigenous to the Norwegians or the Danes or the Swedes because of those long winters. Karen here is in the studio area, and it's textiles really that are her forte. And on the loom in the background, we can see one of her most famous tapestries. It's known as the Four Elements. You can see it here, and it still hangs at Lilla behind the settee or daybed in the dining room. Day is done and good night is Larsson signing off at the end of one of his books. In fact, he's signing off from on the sunny side. And you can see that Karen has left her scissors behind, and there's a book, because he really likes the dining table. The dining table for him is the centre of the Larsson universe. Here's just a lovely close-up. You can perhaps now see the technique of the tapestry, and also this lovely sunflower motif on the cushion. So everything revolves in the Larsson home around the table. So in her kitchen with her children, it shows Karen. I think she's getting a nip of something, don't you there? Looks like something intoxicating. But they're about to play a game, I think, or they're just about to have tea. But the important thing is everything revolves around the table. It's where the children do their drawing and their craft work. It's where you read, you do your sewing, you make your tea, you eat. It's all about conviviality. And this is enshrined in the Larsson house today. So Karen would have supplied the lovely table centre that you're looking at. You've got another view of the four elements. There's that painted cabinet in the corner. And you can see here in this 1980s IKEA catalogue that they've tried to recreate a Larsson interior with the greenery, the red chairs and the green table. And also this idea that the table is a hub. It's where all the activities in the family all congregate around that big table. At Lilla, the drawing room was also multifunctional. It was where they had charades, you know, they played the piano. There was even a little dais, a stage here for the children to act on, literally. But from my point of view, the really obvious Danish thing here is not just the greenery in the window, it's those blue and white stripes. So here again, from a 1980s IKEA catalogue, they've tried to reprise the blue and the white Danish colourway that's so popular. Moving on to Art Nouveau, we're still in Sweden. This is Gunnar Wienenberg, and this is a stunning piece of cameo glass that I photographed in the National Museum in Stockholm. So interesting thing about this stage of the evolution of design in Scandinavia is it's very much looking outside for inspiration. And Art Nouveau was going on at exactly the same time as the arts and crafts. But it was more to do with consumerism and luxury products, seen here in my cameo glass from Sweden, and in the wonderful piece of cameo glass by Emil Gallet. So this is a typical Art Nouveau interior. This is the first Art Nouveau house in Europe, dates to 1893. It's by Victor Horta and it's in Brussels. So you can see, rather than all that sort of wholesome country life, Art Nouveau is very urban based. The decoration is all curvy linear. Sometimes you feel you've been eaten by a plant, as you can see here. And to really emphasize how metropolitan it was, I'm showing you the famous Finnish pavilion from Paris 1900, a high point from an Art Nouveau point of view. The famous group of architects from Finland who created it, Almas Lindgren and Eliel Saarinen. We met Eero Saarinen earlier before they go to America. And you got to Paris 1900, of course, by the metro, and that's designed by Hector Guimard around about 1898-99. Inside the Finnish pavilion, we have Axel Gallen-Kalli Lars rendering of the Kalevala. You know a little bit about Finland. You know that the Kalevala was this great saga that, again, the Finns latched onto in terms of, again, asserting their own identity. Remember, they're being oppressed as they see it, either from Sweden or from Russia. And the Sampo is the boat that they are attempting to defend. And although it was the Finnish pavilion, it had other Scandinavian design within it. So from Norway, Gerhard Munter sent this wonderful tapestry of the three suitors, which is the polar bear, as you can see, or it's actually one polar bear. It's sort of like split screen. The polar bear wooing. He's been enchanted. He's really a handsome prince, but he's been turned into a polar bear. I always think she looks rather like Aubrey Beardsley has had a go at her. And the idea is that if you stand under the Northern Lights, ladies, you'll be more likely to give birth to a boy. So for Art Nouveau, I'm going to show you Ålesund. If you've ever been to Norway, you'll know that this is a favourite port destination, because it's entirely Jugendstil in style. And Jugendstil is the name that we give to Art Nouveau in the north. We're looking towards the Swan Apothecary, And that's now a museum devoted to Jugendstil. Please note, Charlie McIntosh is looking back at you. And the theme throughout the Swan Pharmacy is, of course, owls for wisdom. It's a bit like being on the, stage set for Harry Potter, owls. As you go round Ålesund, you'll see that they like granite. That's like the hard climate of the north, and they play lots of references to Viking. So we've got a Viking grinning helmet looking at you here from the front of a warehouse for fish. Or here on a capital, we've got the grinning helmet in the centre and the Viking ships coming out to either side. So to represent Art Nouveau in terms of luxury items, we've gone for Royal Copenhagen. Arnold Krogh came along, I should know G. Arnold Krogh came along and revolutionized, in fact, Royal Copenhagen by introducing new technologies, these very beautiful pale underglazed colors. And when he showed his new products at Paris 1889, that's the Eiffel Tower exhibition, he was lauded as the equivalent in Denmark of Emile Gallé. He was very influenced by Japan. But as we've just recently had a Women's Day, I thought I would put in this one, which is painted by Marianne Hoss, to show you that this design revolution provided new opportunities for women. So Japan is really where Arnold Krogh will get his inspiration. And this is one of the defining elements, really, in terms of understanding what Art Nouveau is all about. In minimalism, asymmetry, and this is a stylized iris, which is then being literally transcribed onto the Royal Copenhagen plate. The vase is a very famous one by Arnold Krogh. So vase with a Japanese wild carp, and there's the Japanese print from which it's taken. And again, they like the symbolism, as the carp is said to signal vitality and is an allegory for fertility. That's a nice idea. I couldn't resist. I only found this today. I've been to The Hague, but I missed this. This was Denmark's gift to The Hague's Peace Palace. And I've always wondered why Copenhagen loved polar bears. It's one of the sort of, they're very common. Obviously, they are reduced versions of these wonderful polar bears and sea lions. Isn't it fantastic? However, really what kept Royal Copenhagen going then as now is the blue and the white. So just like in Sweden, they are obsessed with blue and white. So this is known as the fluted blue and white, and was one of the products that Arnold Krogh sort of completely revolutionized and gave it a whole new lease of life. However, there were plenty of rivals. We're going to see another porcelain company in a minute, a Swedish one, Strand. But even within, within Denmark, we have Bing Grøndal. This is Effie Hegeman Lindenkron. That's a mouthful, but you can see what I mean here about a tour de force in ceramics. So I'm not actually quite sure how effective they were in putting anything in. They're completely pierced, so you can't really use them as flower vases. They're flower vases in their own right. And again, this sort of combination of artistry and technology is typical of the Art Nouveau era. So I promise you some Råstrand. The designer there is Alvar Aalto. So we're back in Sweden. And so again, this idea is that artists now design. So Råstrand is again like Royal Copenhagen, reinvented by Arnold Krogh. Aalto does the same for Råstrand. Poppies, thistles, very popular Art Nouveau emblems. Pewter fish at the top, same guy, Alf Aalto. And then the walruses on the vase down the bottom. I do love Art Nouveau. His most famous design is this dragonfly tea set, again with the dragonfly making the handle. However, I've really honed in here on Georg Jensen, because I never know with Jensen whether he's really Art Nouveau or arts and crafts. He seems to straddle both. His retail, or his workshop, I should say, was opened in 1904, and his retail shop in 1912. The silver and semi-precious stones and the love of dragonflies, as you see at the top, make him more obviously, well, the dragonfly makes him very obviously Art Nouveau, but the silver and semi-precious stones and this emphasis on craft make him more obviously part of William Morris's arts and crafts movement. He likes natural forms. So in addition to the dragonfly, the other theme that you're looking at here, doves. And he loves things like moonstone, labradorite, semi-precious stones from South America, but also amber, which, as you know, is from the Baltic. And he is really one of the outstanding craftsmen of the opening years of the 20th century, producing schoonwerk, which is their local name, really, for Art Nouveau, or beautiful work. So if I ever win the lottery, I'm having one of these. I particularly would like to have the pendant, which is in the form of peacocks, which is a very obvious Art Nouveau motif. And the reason for the pendants hanging down is because he's based all of these designs on native Danish brooches, again, going back to folk art and this idea of looking for identity. He, however, realized, like William Morris, that it was good to collaborate. And so he brings in, this is Johan Oroda, who was a very, well, a multi-talented William Morris character, painter, furniture designer, but best known for his metalwork. So the grapes here, hanging from this taxa, that's designed by Jensen himself in 1918. But this really famous footed bowl, supported by Lily of the Valley, was designed by Roda and is so famous that it turns up on a Danish stamp. I wanted just to show you how you go from over-decorated Art Nouveau to the minimalism of the 1920s. So the Roda gravy boat, believe it or not, is decorated with pea pods. That's supposed to be a pea pod, but his famous jug of 1920, not made till 1925 because it seemed to be too radical, has no decoration at all. The form is the decoration. So very much influenced by this new design ethos that comes in after the First World War. Again, it sort of splits between the minimalists and those that like ornament. So Anton Mikkelsen, who was a rival to Jensen in terms of metalworking, produces this magnificent wine jug, and Kay Fisker is a man and an architect, and that shows you exemplary minimalism. Whereas courtesy of Arno Marinovsky, we've got something more obviously Art Deco, which brings me to Art Deco. So to represent Art Deco, I've chosen Orifors, though many of you might be familiar with it from the 1950s, when it was very chic to collect Orifors. This is known as the Paris Cup. It was made for Paris 1925, which was a high point in terms of the evolution of Art Deco, and it's decorated on its lid with the famous City Hall in Stockholm, which, as you can see, dates to 1909 to 1923. I hope you might have visited this if you've ever been to Stockholm, and this is the famous Golden Hall in the centre, a wonderfully enthroned image of Stockholm on the far wall with the world around her at her feet, and in her lap a rather beautiful mosaic rendering of City Hall itself. And there's, even now in the 1920s, a huge emphasis on craftsmanship. So one of the most outstanding elements in the so-called Swedish Grace period is the revival of marquetry. So this is Carl Malmsten. This is the sort of thing that would have been sent to Paris 1925, entire marquetry cabinets. And these I photographed, in fact, this one here is in the museum in Stockholm, but this one is closer to home, though not near to Truro. My apologies. This is Eltham Palace, which is southeast London. And this is the home of the Courtauld family. And it was terribly très chic to have anything Swedish in the 1920s or 1930s. So the marquetry that you see here, which commemorates Venice on one side and Stockholm on the other, you know, was the Courtaulds trying to be literally right on point. I always think it looks like you're on an ocean liner. It's of that period, of course. So here is the magnificent hand-carved cameo produced by Orifors, particularly in the 1920s, when there was a lot of money about before the Wall Street crash. They were obviously attracted to classical subject matter, backhands, dancing. And here's, again, showing you down the bottom, is one of the Orifors craftsmen, hand engraving using a lapidary wheel. Then Viking Strand, at the top is his shark killer. Down the bottom we have the Java dancer, to remind you that Art Deco was very much influenced by Orientalism. And I love Crowded Skies because it's emphasizing the modernity of Art Deco. It's got chimneys and smoke, but again, that's actually in the V&A. You can see this engraving better if I show you this. Edward Hull's wonderful fireworks. It helped Orifors to win the gold medal at Paris 1925 and robbed, of course, René Lalique. He was pushed slightly lower down the pecking order. And the reason for that is this is all done by hand, whereas much of Lalique's glass is press molded. I think it's magnificent. I love the fireworks bursting. And then by 1937, they moved into something completely different. The Ariel technique is more like paperweight. It's layers of glass. But we've now moved into something completely different, something organic. By the time you get to the end of the 1930s, you can see that all my Scandinavian designers who have been influenced by arts and crafts, Art Nouveau or Art Deco and Modernism are now starting to really evolve what will become, in the post-Second World War era, Scandinavian modern. So these are examples, again, of Orifors from the 1930s. You might be able to make out the butterfly, and over here some sort of scaraby insect. So enter Alvar Aalto, who's often said to be the most important modernist architect working in Scandinavia, though Arne Jacobsen, who's slightly later, gives him a run for his money. He's Danish. This is the famous Paemio bentwood chair, and it's for a sanitarium, so tuberculosis. So you wanted something that was easy to clean, no upholstery. And the big thing about Aalto is he loves natural materials and he loves curves, seen here in the ceiling of the library at Vivalry. Now you're laughing, I'm hoping, because you might recognize those stools. Here, one of his most famous designs that you can still buy is the so-called, this is the Savoy vase, the Savoy as in the hotel in London. And this is made by Itala, so you can still buy this today in various different sizes. But the important thing is it looks like an amoeba, sort of like he likes curves. So initially, Alvar Aalto is influenced by the Bauhaus. So on this side, this is the Bauhaus with its, looks like diving boards, the balconies off the back of the building. This is the student accommodation. And the Bauhaus was the most important art school in Europe from 1919 to when it closed, around about 1931-32. And you can see that the Palamio tuberculosis sanatorium has taken the theme of the cantilevered balconies. When you're suffering from tuberculosis, what you need is plenty of fresh air. And inside, you can see some very obvious synergies between the Bauhaus in the 1920s, and this is the Aalto sanitarium. This is the Bauhaus on the outside, and this is an interior view of the staircase. And this is the Bauhaus at Dessau. So these buildings date to 1925 to 27. So this is Aalto being uber modernist and walking in the footsteps of the Germans. But then he seems to sort of like devise his own way of looking at things, which involves these curves. So he doesn't like tubular steel. That's very much a feature of the Bauhaus. So I'm showing you the Wassily Kandinsky chair, and there for comparison, using benchwood, is the Aalto Paemio armchair. So the tank chair at the top is by Aalto. These two here are by Marcel Brouwer. They're there because they're metal. This one's by Mies van der Rohe. They're all cantilevered, that's the theme. And the reason for that is that in these open plan interiors, you don't want to see the furniture. You want to get rid of all that padding. You want transparency, as you can see in this contemporary advert. This is by Heath Robinson, a name I'm hoping you recognise, who doesn't like German modernism, and so has literally joined all the chairs, tubular steel chairs, together into tubular spaghetti. I love it. So by comparison, this is the interior of Aalto's house and studio in Helsinki. But you can see by comparison to the German aesthetic, this is much cozier, warm, textiles, wood rather than metal. It's been beautifully restored. And those curves come over in his masterpiece. This is the Cultural Centre in Helsinki. So you can see here on the outside the wonderful curve of the building. This is the atrium with its big curve. And here even the ceiling in the auditorium curves. So natural materials and curves are really what make Scandinavian modern much more humane than German modernism. So here's Eero Saarinen, the TWA Flight Centre, which has been perfectly preserved and open to the public and dates, as you can see, to the late 50s and is the spirit of flight. And this in the inside, well, we all thought we were going to live like this, didn't we? This is Star Trek Enterprise, white surfaces and organic forms, and how the computer telling us what plane to get on. It didn't quite happen, unfortunately, but a lot of the designs from the 1960s are very space age. So the ideal Swedish, Danish interior is this one. Nothing in it, including people. Around the table we have the famous chairs by Arne Jacobsen. The light fittings are by Paul Hengingsen. He's Danish. And I love the fact that the children have been banished to the Wendy house outside. Nothing to corrupt this purist interior. So here are our light fittings. They look like spaceships, don't they? That's my theme here. And this is the infamous artichoke lamp. I say infamous because I once watched a lady spend 5 hours trying to make one. So we're coming to the end with Arne Jacobsen, who is the most famous Danish architect and designer. And his ant chair originally came with 3 legs, though more conventionally with 4. It's part metal and part wood. So this is the big difference between Denmark and Germany. You know, the Bauhaus is all about rather cold materials, metal and leather. And this is really all about sort of like using natural materials and much more curvy linear shapes, as you can see. There are 7 in the series. There are lots of variants, as you can see. And you can get them in lots of different colours, either in plywood or in plastic. You can even buy them from John Lewis. In those open spaces, it was very important to have a womb-like chair, exemplified by the egg chair, better known for being on Big Brother. And next to it is the equally famous chair by Charles and Ray Eames, husband and wife, American team of designers. Or you might have a swan chair. Really the thing that joins all these chairs together, I'm hoping you're noticing, is the central pedestal, very much a design feature of the 50s and early 60s. The swan chair does not work with legs, does it? As you can see down the bottom. And everything gets, in fact, a pedestal, including your wine glass. So these are magnificent wine glasses by Orrefors, by Niels Landberg. So these are Swedish. I think they might make your wine taste rather good, though they're a little top heavy, aren't they? Anyway, the main thing is that you have a central pedestal. So the Eero Saarinen tulip chairs. And, you know, I'm get very envious of my husband, who's a little older than me, who had all of these when he first got married, and you could buy them through Habitat. Why she's wearing that, I have no idea. But again, it's to remind you that all of this is rather space age. So there's a tulip table and chairs. Then we have the bubble and ball chairs by Eero Aarnio, who I think is Finnish. Yes, he is. I couldn't miss showing you this one because she's in period costume, or in fact it may be a 1960s photograph. So you can either have them like a perspex bubble hanging, or you can literally hang it from the ceiling. I love these photographs because can you see there's nobody in them to upset the equilibrium. So back to Jensen in the 1950s, they have Henning Kopel, and I would love to own the pregnant duck jug. Or one of the other designs. There's African Girl, there's Swan. I think it's this one that's Swan, and this is Pregnant Duck. And this is one that they still make today in stainless steel. Looks like a rather elegant lady, doesn't it? These are all by Kopel. I'd like this one in silver. I can't afford it. As you can see, it's about 15,000. They have to make it for you. It's like, it reminds me of the TWA, you know, spirit of flight. It looks like a cloud or a sand dune. And the trouble is the stainless steel isn't anywhere near as elegant, is it, as the silver. But then what I can afford and spend all my money on, and if we have time at the end, you can look at what I'm wearing, is Jensen jewellery. So the Henning Koppel necklace at the top and matching bracelet are said to be inspired by either shark's teeth or dinosaur bones. The one on the right-hand side is simply called Splash. And some of these are revived and still sold by Jensen. So Viviana Toren, as we like to refer to her, Danish designer, but remember that again, because it's fluid in terms of geography, she's actually Swedish in terms of her birthright. So this is the famous watch that doesn't have any numerals on it. She hated time, you'll be pleased to know. So she designed a watch that falls off your wrist and has no numerals on. Her most famous design is Mobius, the brooch down the bottom and the ring. It's a sort of eternal spiral. And I'm so envious of her because look, wasn't she beautiful to look at? Fantastically good designer and just beautiful looking woman. Very, you know, Jackie Kennedy-like. So I come to my last couple of slides and you will have realised that this was a romp through Scandinavian art and design. I want to remind you that it takes us a while to catch up. A lot of progressive design we reject initially. So this was the original design for the SAS Hotel by Arne Jacobsen and made by Mikkelsen. They're now made by Jensen in stainless steel. 1957 they were designed. Nobody really knew how to use them. Well, the forks looked, you know, more like toothpicks. And what about the spoons? There was one for the left and one for the right. They're supposed to be soup spoons. So initially they were rejected, but then they turn up, as you can see, in outer space in 2001, A Space Odyssey. So I'm hoping that you're seeing how in the 60s, we really thought we were all going to go to the moon. We were going to live in a sort of wonderful modernist space age interior. I'll leave you with, from my lecture, my last slide, you know, thinking about what makes something, you know, a famous design. And sometimes it's a combination of a good design. This is the famous chair by Arne Jacobsen. But what really made it famous or notorious was Christine Keeler sitting on it. So although we've talked about democratic design through IKEA and of course companies like Marimekko, at the end of the day, what really makes something sell is having a celebrity sat on it, ideally with no clothes on, as Christina Keeler does here. The chair itself is now in the V&A with a real Arne Jacobsen chair next to it. That was actually a clone, which I find rather amusing, and a photograph of Christina, just to remind you that marketing is very much about fashion and sex sells everything. I just want to end by pointing out that if you really like Carl Larsson, and like me, you've always wanted to visit his studio, I am hoping to take a trip there with the company that I was talking about at the beginning of our time together at Travel Editions. And if all goes according to plan, we had to postpone it from 2020. Obviously, we'll go at the end of this October. It's not cheap. It's about £1,800. It's Sweden, remember? But it's very hard to get to Carl Larsson's studio house, as you probably gathered, it's in the middle of nowhere. So you might want to have a look at that or some of my other Travel Editions holidays online. And finally, I've gone out on my own and I offer lectures on a Wednesday morning, and they start again on the 17th of March. I'll be doing Tissot, Whistler, Alma Tadema and Gustav Klimt. And this is basically to all keep you sane until lockdown ends, which hopefully will be quite soon. And finally, we have here details of my website. That's anne-anderson.com, but where you'll find, in fact, notes, because I've got a blog and all sorts of things that might, again, you might be interested in looking at. And you'll also find details of my YouTube channel, Anne Anderson Art and Design History channel, where you'll find I offer quite a few lectures for you just to view for free. You know, Art Society lectures that I've done or other Art Society groups. And so hopefully these again will help to keep you sane while lockdown continues. And yes, that is the cover of my latest book on Art Nouveau architecture.